Please join me in welcoming Richard Mason. And these two will be in dialogue, and Richard will read, and then we will have you sign books over there at that table. So, welcome.
Sounds good, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Great. Listen, one of the things about Richard Mason that grabbed me the first time I started reading his work is his first sentences. I'm going to read you the first line from his first novel, The Drowning People, published in '99. My wife of more than 45 years shot herself yesterday afternoon. I mean, so then I read History of the Pleasure Seeker, his fourth novel. Would you read the first line for us, please, of that one?
With pleasure. First of all, good evening, everybody. It's such a treat to have you all here. Friendly home crowd in the middle of a long book tour. And thank you so much to the Strand for hosting us. It feels like a special thrill to be in this beautiful room on this special night. First line of History of a Pleasure Seeker is, and somebody actually, the other night, I was at a reading and they got me to write it in their book, which I always think is a fun thing, get a writer to write a sentence in their work. Anyway, this is it. The adventures of adolescence had taught Piet Barol that he was extremely attractive to most women and to many men.
Aha. So, do the opening lines come to you first, or some version of you when you start a book like this? Do you craft them later, or is it different each time you're going through a book? And in particular, with this fourth novel, what did you start with, and what did you end up with those first lines? Briefly. I mean, I don't want to.
Well, I wrote this book by hand in a bid to find a quickness and concision in the writing. And I then typed it up on a computer, but every word that's in the book was first written by hand. Sometimes I regret the changes I made on a computer. And actually, I was having this the other night. Not quite buyer's remorse, but writer's remorse. I read the first page in the original draft. And this is not the first sentence. And this sentence came about a page in, and when I was revising it, I thought, this is a book I want to take people right into the depths of the story immediately, and this seemed to me like it was too good to miss.
Hear that, guys? Writers out there, cut the first page or so. Sometimes it works that way. Not a bad idea. I know you want to read from a specific section of the novel that's set in New York. Are you ready to do that now? Do you want to do that now?
I guess so, right?
Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay, guys. I think you'll recognize some of what's going on here.
The book is largely set in Amsterdam during the Belle Epoque. Can you hear me? The book is largely set in Amsterdam during the Belle Epoque. But as a recent immigrant to these shores, I thought that maybe I should read a little story set in New York in 1907, a story about this city and the crazy things it can make people do. All you need to know is that these are the three characters. One is Martin Vermeulen Sickert. He's in his 50s, Europe's leading hotelier. He's just invested in a hotel of unrivaled opulence at the bottom of Central Park called the Plaza. You might have heard of it. Things are not going well. He has spent far more money than he anticipated, and he's facing a little bit of a cash flow crisis. His wife, Jacobina, is with him. She is in her late 40s. She loves her husband deeply, but for reasons that the reader is aware of, she's extremely cross with him. And she won't express it. With them is her maid, Agneta Hamels, who is 32. Two weeks later, Agneta Hamels gave way to the temptations that had besieged her since her first sight of New York. Standing on the Lusitania's deck as she steamed into the harbor, the city's glinting towers had struck her like a land in a fairy tale. The chaos of porters and automobiles on the quay had given this paradise an earthly dimension. But in the seething swirls of humanity, she had glimpsed a treasure that cozy little Amsterdam could never offer: anonymity. Agneta had spent her life in the company of people who knew her. She had never strayed 3 streets beyond her home without encountering an acquaintance, and this had required her to spend 32 years on guard. She was a private woman with a dread of gossip. New York's utter indifference excited her as much as it frustrated Martin. As Jacobina's maid, she had traveled extensively through Europe and seen much to admire, but nothing, not Versailles, nor the Colosseum, not even the soaring cathedral at Cologne, had inspired the rush of love New York did. She had accompanied her mistress on shopping trips that left her wide-eyed with wonder. Crossing town in a hansom cab as the avenues swung out to left and right, she had been unable to contain her enthusiasm or to understand Jacobina's lack of it. The joylessness with which Mevrouw Vermeulen-Sickert's acquired expensive clothes disgusted her. It seemed grossly unfair to Agneta that a woman so free from financial constraint should derive so little pleasure from it. And this thought began to undermine her ability to refrain from judging her betters. From her little room on the top floor of the Metropole Hotel, Agneta stared out over the city's lush park and sparkling rooftops, her heart aflame. She was allowed an afternoon off once a fortnight. Though the first of these was delirious, her second solitary promenade was spoiled by her simple Dutch clothes, which did not at all complement the triumphant splendor of the city. It was on her return from this unsatisfactory expedition that Agneta was beset by the most seductive temptation of her life. As she put away Jacobina's latest purchases and added them to the inventory of her clothes, the desire to wear one of them and to wander down Fifth Avenue like a fine lady took hold of her. It became imperative when she removed from a box an afternoon gown of peacock blue satin with a jacket trimmed in ermine. She held it up to the glass. She was not as tall as Jacobina, but she knew that in the closet was a pair of very high-heeled shoes that would solve this problem. She went to the door and locked it, though she knew her mistress was at a fitting. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She was not on duty again until 6. Might she not? She did. She took off her own dress and hung it in the wardrobe. Then she sat at the dressing table and arranged her hair. When that was done to her satisfaction, she put on the peacock blue satin. Bravely, she stepped into the high-heeled shoes and contemplated herself in the mirror. The transformation was dazzling. She went to the safe and removed Jacobina's jewel box. From this, she took the sapphire choker that had been bought for Constance and a pair of pearl earrings. Agneta was at heart a modest woman, but the city's immodesty had infected her. Now she laughed to see how magnificent she looked. She left the Vermeulen-Sickert suite and entered the elevator. Although the operator saw her every day, he did not recognize her and bowed. 2 gentlemen entered the lift and bowed also. "May I order a carriage for you, miss?" asked the doorman, as though he could think of no greater honor. "No, thank you. I prefer to walk." And Agneta swept past him to find that the crowds on Fifth Avenue parted for her, and every gentleman among them doffed his hat. That same afternoon, October the 21st, 1907, an unforeseen catastrophe occurred that provided Martin with conclusive proof of God's directed wrath. He had an appointment with the chairman of the Knickerbocker Trust Company and had spent the morning honing what he intended to be a brilliant performance. If he could obtain a further $1 million in America, he felt confident of making up any further shortfall with European capital, and thus prevailing against the odds. He was aware, however, that nothing repels credit like desperation, and because he was desperate, he had taken the step of ordering a cocktail at luncheon. He emerged from his cab 10 minutes early, feeling cavalier. He was disconcerted to find a line outside the company's offices, and annoyed when the doorman refused to let him step past it. "But I have an appointment with Mr. Barney." "Mr. Barney's seeing no one today." Over this individual's shoulder, Martin could see into the green marble banking room. It took him a moment to decode the chaos at the teller's windows. Every person in the long line was withdrawing money, apparently as much as they could. The doorman pushed him roughly aside, and when Martin said, "I will report this insolence to Mr. Barney," the man shrugged and said, "Mr. Barney's resigned. Join the line like everyone else." To be treated in this peremptory fashion reminded Martin of slights he had endured in his youth and overcome. Seeing that nothing more was to be gained by complaining, he joined the line, noting with alarm that among the ranks of messenger boys were persons of quality, evidently unwilling to rely on subordinates to retrieve their funds for them. From a lady in green serge and fox fur, he learned that Mr. Barney had been implicated in a failed attempt to corner the stock of the United Copper Company, that this had exposed a web of risky commitments between the banks he had an interest in, and that it was rumored the Knickerbocker Trust Company did not have sufficient reserves to honor the claims of its depositors. "But, madam," said Martin, "no bank has sufficient reserves to satisfy all its depositors at once. If everyone would simply calm down." But it seemed that no one was prepared to calm down. As 34th Street filled with anxious clients, the panic of the crowd took hold of Martin too. Not only did he require a further $1 million in credit, the $500,000 he had raised in Amsterdam were in the trust company's vaults, and their loss would precipitate a crisis he might not survive. The Knickerbocker closed its immense bronze doors promptly at 5 o'clock, while there remained dozens of people ahead of Martin in the queue. Were it not for the lady in fox fur, he might have abandoned his stoicism and begun to shout, as others were doing. Instead, he said goodbye calmly and walked through eddying crowds to his hotel. From the newspapers, he learned that J.P. Morgan had gathered the city's leading financiers in his library to find a way of preventing a full-scale run on the banks. Also, that the National Bank of Commerce had refused to clear the Knickerbocker's checks. It annoyed Martin profoundly to be a nonentity in this tangled city. In Amsterdam, he would have been in Morgan's library, taking decisions. In New York, he was just another fellow in a fix. He found his wife having hysterics in front of the hotel's manager. A sapphire choker was missing, and her pearl earrings. She had not yet discovered the loss of the peacock blue dress. "My maid never forgets to lock the safe. It must have been forced," she was shouting, her voice high and distracted. The Metropole's manager was used to defending his staff from the accusations of absent-minded patrons. He pointed out, most respectfully, that no violence had been done to the safe. "Could you, perhaps, have taken the jewels off elsewhere, madam?" he asked gently. And when Jacobina insisted that she had not, and that her maid would have found them if she had, he put on his gravest face and said, "Is your own servant wholly to be trusted?" "Of course," snapped Jacobina. But she was wrong. Agneta Hemos had lived her life scrupulously. She had cared for her parents, both now dead, and worked very hard to pay her older brother's gambling debts. She had never stolen anything in her life. But as she stepped daintily down Fifth Avenue in Jacobina's gown and Constance's jewels, she found the experience addictively delightful. She went into a shop and was fussed over by the attendants. It was a jeweler's, and she asked to see several diamond bracelets. For a happy 15 minutes, she behaved as if she might buy one. No one had ever bowed and scraped before Agneta Hemos, nor told her that wrists as graceful as hers deserved the best. She pretended to consider an emerald ring, but in fact, she was weighing another possibility that had opened before her, as glittering as the stone on her finger. If she chose to disappear in this vast country of adventurers, she was sure she could. "I shall return tomorrow," she told the tail-suited salesman deceitfully. "Keep the ring and those 2 bracelets aside for me." She left the shop, trembling. It was almost 6 o'clock. She walked back towards the metropole, wondering if there was a God, and if so, what he would do to her if she did what she was contemplating. If he existed, she was sure he was a he. Agneta had sat through hundreds of church services, but could never decide if she truly believed. As she reached the hotel, she set the deity a test. She would enter like a guest and ride the elevator in her finery. If she was seen and apprehended, she would face the consequences. If not, she would claim her reward for the years she had spent anticipating other people's whims. The doorman bowed low to her. So did the elevator attendant. Neither Martin nor Jacobina was in the lobby, and she gained her own room without incident. Once in it, she undressed quickly, put on a dress of her own, packed the peacock blue satin in her valise with all the underwear she possessed, placed the sapphire choker and pearls between its folds, called a bellboy, and instructed him to take her case downstairs and order a cab for her. Next, she went to the Vermeulen Sickert suite, which the hotel's manager had just left, and expressed the greatest outrage that someone should have profited by her absence to steal from her beloved mistress. She helped Jacobina undress and advised her to lie down before dinner. She ordered some bouillon for Martin, whose ashen face irritated her. How easily he could bear the loss of a few precious stones. She left him trying to place a telephone call to Philadelphia and went into his wife's dressing room. There, she selected 5 gowns, 2 cloaks, 7 pairs of shoes, and a muff, and placed them in a trunk, into which she also placed the contents of Jacobina's jewel box and a quantity of cash. She put on a double-breasted traveling dress with a velvet collar and a chic hat. The dressing room had its own door to the corridor, and she summoned a footman to take her luggage downstairs. Again, the elevator attendant bowed to her. As the doorman lifted her into her hired carriage, she pressed a dollar bill into his hand. It was all the spending money Jacobina had given her, and it gave her pleasure to leave it behind. "Grand Central Station," she told the driver, and when they had turned the corner and no one had run after her, she began to cry with happiness. Thank you.
It's such a marvelous way you get inside a character. Like Agneta, don't you feel you're with her, you're walking, you're imagining these. I saw you laughing. It's really not easy to do that. So it's a very tricky thing. One of the marvels of this novel is that Richard's inside each of the characters in that way. Martin, for instance, and Martin saying that I would have been in J.P. Morgan's library back in Amsterdam. So this is a kind of a side trip they've made. Tell me a little bit about a combination of the time in New York when you're describing an economic collapse of global import, and also going back to the Gilded Crescent in Amsterdam and the research you did in Amsterdam as well. So kind of the research in New York and Amsterdam.
You know, Jane, when I started writing books, I wrote them in a very different way from the way I write them now. with the drowning people, I started with the sniff of a feeling of an idea, and I just wrote in quest of a story. Thousands of pages of drafts later, I discovered or came to believe that writing in quest of a story is maybe not the best way to do it. Now I think and think and think and sketch and go to visit the places I'm writing about. I try to learn pieces of music or languages, and I think and think and think and sketch and think, and then I end up with maybe 100-page outline of the book, and I start to write. And of course, as you get closer to a scene, it comes into focus for you. And then very occasionally, your characters go off on their own. And in fact, when I planned this trip, I mean, Martin he's in the middle of the financial crisis of 1907, the great banking panic that has a lot to do with the banking crisis that we've just been through, although it was handled in a very different way. And I knew that he and his wife went to New York, but I had no idea of what Agneta Hemos would do.
She went off on her own?
She went off on her own. Oh. It was really that's why I love reading that passage, because she was just unpacking one of Jacobina's dresses, and suddenly she decided to put it on. And having put it on, I thought, well, she's got to steal it, right? And having decided to steal with it, to get away with it. And so it was a moment where a background character stepped into the light and showed me the way.
It's a wonderful moment, and she's an adventurer. But Piet Barol, your major character, is the primary adventurer in this particular novel, which I think you've called an adventure story for grown-ups.
That's how I thought of it. I wanted to be a quick, brisk, throw yourself in yarn, and it has a certain adult sub-theme, so definitely not for children.
Well, speaking of your adult sub-thing, I think we have to get into the sensual erotic elements of this novel, because they are something that most of the critics pay attention to, and your writing about erotic matters is quite elegant. I'm wondering how hard it is for you to write about sex, and why you chose to do it this time around. With Piet's story?
I was thrown a challenge by a reader during a publicity tour for my last book, and she said, "You never write about sex." And I thought, well, in Natural Elements, an 80-year-old woman does masturbate, so I don't think I've never written about it. But after I thought, actually, no, in some ways you're right. And a lot of writers, including myself, tend to duck it. You know, with some wonderful exceptions, Edmund White, Alan Hollinghurst, Bret Easton Ellis, though he writes about sex in a very sick way. Some people do it and do it very well. It's hard to do. And as I thought more about that comment, I thought, you cannot create a fully rounded, three-dimensional character while saying nothing about their erotic experience of life. Whether you're having sex, I'm noticing a lot of nods in the audience. Glad to see that. Whether you're having sex, whether you're not, what it's like. In so many books, the characters hold hands, walk to the bedroom door, and then it's the end of the chapter. And the next chapter begins the next morning. But what happens in the intervening 9 hours is of key psychological importance, right? And not just in a prurient way. I mean, it matters how people were feeling. So with this book, I decided I'm going to be with my characters whatever happens. And then, you know, in England, there's a terrifying award that just the idea of inhibits a lot of writers. It's the Bad Sex Award. And you're very aware that if you write a novel full of sex, you might be up for it. Thank God I was not in this case. Yeah. But I made a couple of decisions. I thought the narrator has got to be completely unembarrassed throughout. You've got to stay... What separates the literary writing about a character's erotic life from, say, pornography, is that it's about psychology, what's happening in your head, and how what's happening to your body affects that. And then I decided no euphemisms, no hairy diadems. And I set myself another challenge too. I wanted to write about pleasure from a woman's point of view. And this is one of the fun things about my job. I mean, there are difficult things too, but one of the fun things is that if you're genuinely interested in human nature, people will tell you the most incredible things about all manner of stuff. I mean, for my last book, I told an old lady in a nursing home who was clearly losing her mind. Natural Elements is about a lady who's losing her mind and having the time of her life. And I said to this 98-year-old woman, after I told her the plot of the book, you know, losing your mind could clearly be terrifying, but maybe it could be quite fun. And she leant across the plastic tablecloth and she said, "It is." And she told me all about it. And I love those moments in my work. And so clearly, you know, writing about sex, I had the opportunity to have a number of intimate conversations, some with people I know, some with strangers. I mean, I was on an aeroplane going to Dallas, and often when people ask me what I do, I'm hesitant to say I'm a writer because if they've read your books, then it can sometimes be a fun conversation that results. But if not, they typically say, "What are your books about?" And that's a hard thing to describe in a single line when you've written 4. So I say I'm a software developer or something. But in this case, the woman said to me, you know, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a writer." And she said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on a scene in which a woman in her late 40s spends one of the most enjoyable and deeply satisfying afternoons of her entire life in the company of a 24-year-old man who is very obliging in many ways." And so we started to have a conversation, but not loudly. I mean, I'm stressing this. We're talking quietly, very, very softly. And this woman, as it turned out, had a lot to say on this and other topics. And we got really quite into it in a way that sometimes only strangers on an aeroplane can. And she was sitting at the window. I was in the middle. There was a man on my left. And after 20 minutes, he got up and moved. I was so embarrassed. And then I thought, well, maybe it was tough for him, you know, listening and knowing what he's been doing wrong all these years. And I hope that he received a little instruction that his partners will be grateful for.
Or maybe she didn't even have to get a credit since you never knew her name, I assume.
Oh, she is in the acknowledgement.
Oh, she is in the acknowledgements.
Yeah, but nobody knows.
Nobody knows which ones. Oh, my. Well, anyway, you will find when you read the book that it has some wonderful erotic passages. It also has beautiful descriptions of a whole other sensual world, which is music. Can you tell me a little bit about what music does for you as you're working on a book like this?
You know, I always loved to play the piano when I was a kid, and if your major passion, which for me was always writing, suddenly becomes your job, it has lots of quite unpleasant consequences, because the thing that was always super fun for you to do, suddenly you're conscious that, you know, somebody's paying you, you're writing to a deadline. I now actually never write to deadlines, I never get paid in advance, but when I was in my early 20s, it wasn't like that. And you know that people will judge you in public, that, you know, former chairs of the National Book Critics Circle might read it one day, and it totally changes the whole experience. And for me, it was wonderful to do something artistic, like make music, that I didn't have to be good at.
Off duty.
Off duty, exactly. And then I found that actually you can get a lot of stories from pieces of music. There's a lot of music in the book, but music that's not in the book also told me some of its outlines. There's a wonderful, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard the first movement of Bernstein's Piano Concerto in F. It's totally the wrong period for this. It's about the sort of jazz age, but in theme it's perfect. It's about stock market bubbles and the rise and fall. And the shape of the music goes up and it goes down, and it goes a little bit higher up, and then it goes down, and it goes a lot higher up, and then it goes down. And then there's this final crescendo, and at the end of it, total silence for a beat and a little bit more than a beat. And then the orchestra goes, wow! And I thought in this book, somebody who is always silent at a key moment, she steps into the light and she says something, and all hell breaks loose. And you know that in the end that did happen. And I totally got that from a piece of music.
Okay. Very good. Do you want to mention anything about where Piet ends up in the end? There's a sequel coming, or at least one sequel coming to this book. For those of you who read it, there's more, and it says to be continued. Can you want to talk a little bit about where he's headed?
Sure, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. You know, how do I even put this? To me, one of the fascinating things about literature is that it can show you and say something profound about the complex chain of cause and effect that create the present. I mean, we're all here because of decisions our great-great-great-grandparents took. We probably don't even know their names, and we almost certainly know nothing about the emotional situations they were in when they took these steps. The writer can say something about that by making up a whole world. And actually, History of a Pleasure Seeker is part of a constellation of novels that I'm making. Absolutely and emphatically not a series. They're meant to be read in any order. There'll be 6 or 7. And so by the time they're all done, if I ever get around to writing them, the individual reader will be able to take a path through them that is wholly their own. 61543 or 46152, however you do it. And yes, this book does end on a little bit of a cliffhanger in a suite at the Mount Nelson Hotel in 1908. And the next one picks up about 5 years later. But a lot of the characters from this book will meander through later ones to come.
Does Agneta come back?
You know, I'm beginning to feel that Agneta needs a whole book of her own. Particularly as I read this, you know, I had a brilliant reading the other day, and somebody came up to me and she said, "I love that story, and Agneta's never going to sell those jewels. She's, however broke she gets, she's going to hang on to that choker because it makes her feel good." And I thought, that's right, she's never going to sell them. And I made a little note, and it went into I have sort of 6 boxes in my study of different books slowly taking shape. And so
You started a new box.
I have this sense that Agneta heads off somewhere in the American Deep South.
Would you show your handwritten manuscript? Just hold it up for a minute. One of the things that Richard told me early on is that he'd written this book by hand instead of into a computer. How many of you write on a computer? Writers on a computer? Have you ever noticed that when you go through it, you keep going through the opening a lot, and then you go all the way to the end, and the front part you've always revised more and more frequently? I hadn't realized exactly what that meant until Richard mentioned it to me, and he said, that's why, look at this book he's written this novel in. It has the title on it. It's a beautiful blue color. It's a little clearly worked on.
You know, one of the things I loved about this, I was trying
Good
to...
handwriting.
Sorry?
Good handwriting.
Not good handwriting, I think,
No.
I'm being polite. But anyway, a lot of handwriting. You know,
It's just so perfect in this room with the first editions and everything. It's beautiful.
I read a wonderful book that inspired at least the style or some of the concerns of this one. Has anyone here read Suite Française by Irene Nemirovsky? Some nods. It's such a wonderful book. And I bought it at an airport. I was waiting for some friends who were coming to spend the weekend. This is when I lived in Scotland. And by the time they came out, I was maybe 20 pages in. And I said, sorry, guys, the whole weekend is over. I'm not going clubbing. I don't want to look around any Scottish castles. I just really have to sit and read this book. So come hang out in my house. I've got a lot of great books. Pick one. It's actually a brilliant way to, I think can say this in a room full of bibliophiles, it's a brilliant way to spend a weekend with friends, everyone just sitting quietly and reading. And Suite Française is not at all about the same things as History of a Pleasure Seeker, but it's told with this wonderful quickness and briskness. You know, so many novels begin with boring, over-ornate descriptions of the weather. And once I'd realized that, I began to see how true it was. And Suite Française, you're just right in, and you care about the characters very deeply. And she writes with this wonderfully rich humanity, however flawed they are. And when it was finished, there's a very sad story attached to the writing of that book, and I urge you not to find out anything about it. Just go and read it, and don't read the back, and when you've read it, then you can acquaint yourself with the circumstances in which it was written. But she felt that she didn't have a lot of time or a lot of paper or a lot of ink. And so I saw the manuscript, and it was dense and covered in words. And I thought, I have to try to recreate some of those tensions as I write this book. Because I wanted History of a Pleasure Seeker to be short. I wanted it to be a full and luscious book in which a ton of stuff happens, but I still wanted it to be short. And of course, the great novels of the 20s and 30s were short. You know, you walk into a bookshop in the 30s and Evelyn Waugh, Virginia Woolf, Graham Greene. I mean, The Great Gatsby is like that long. But it's created this huge world and enduring people for us. And I think that the word processor encourages wordiness. And certainly some of my previous books written on a computer are too wordy. So I liberated myself from the idea that we have to plug ourselves into a wall in order to be creative. And I discovered actually the human brain functions perfectly well without Microsoft Word. And I'm happy to be able to share that with you.
I feel like I've had the great privilege and opportunity of asking all the questions so far, but perhaps somebody out there has a question to ask? Questions from out there?
Yeah.
I read the book. I thought it was amazing. It was really tremendous.
Thank you.
As I'm sitting here listening to you, I think one of the gifts of the book is actually the ending. There will be other books. But as I was wondering, do you see this in a movie-like future? I mean, because the characters are so alive that as I was reading it, even tonight, it seems playing out in the film.
You know, I think that some of the best stories, thanks, there are a couple of other nods from the audience, I appreciate that. I think that some of the best long-form storytelling in our culture at the moment is done on television. And actually, I would History of a Pleasure Seeker, I wrote it to be very episodic. And I think that rather than a movie, I like the idea of making it into television. And in fact, we're just trying to construct a deal that would turn it into 8 parts of TV. So typically, when you take a novel and you turn it into a film, you cut a lot from it and you just take its essence. The fun thing about making it 8 parts of television is that we could add to it. You know, there's all sorts of stuff that I know about this world that I didn't put in the book because I wanted it to be short. But television would give us the chance to play with that. And if you've got a good budget, then you could have, you know, the ocean liner, the plaza being built, all the great clothes, shooting in Amsterdam. I mean, that would be really fun. So fingers crossed.
Other questions out there?
Come on, Worm, this is New York. The world is watching.
Well, let's get back to the Plaza Hotel. Wait a minute, I see somebody.
You read so beautifully. I wondered, have you recorded any of your books?
You know, I haven't, but has anyone been watching Downton Abbey? Yeah. The cousin Matthew in Downton Abbey, Dan Stevens, read the audio of this book, and he does such a good job. At the beginning, I thought maybe I could do it, and it would be quite fun. But actually, once he'd done it, I knew that there's a reason he's a professional actor, and he's just hilarious. So no, and also actually, I have a bit of a lisp. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but if you record me, I sound like I'm talking like this. So it would really be quite annoying to have to read the whole book.
Oh my. Other questions?
Yeah.
I know you've done some philanthropy from the Barol. Do you find it hard to keep the languages apart, the language of creative writing and the language of convincing people
To part with cash. It's funny because some of Piet Barol's talents, he's quite good at getting people to part with cash. I have them too, but I use them in a different way. You know, my first book, The Drowning People, was published when I was very young. I'm South African. I don't really sound it, but I grew up in South Africa. My family is South African. And, you know, I was one of the very privileged white kids of my generation who got a great first world education. And to me, it seemed important to keep some of the great South African schools well-funded, the schools that were originally built for white kids. I mean, now, theoretically, children of any color can go to them, but actually, if you live in a shanty town, your chances of going to one of the best schools in the country is just as bad as it ever was. So I started the K. Mason Foundation in memory of my sister, and we started sending 4 kids to school in '99, since when 100 kids have been the whole way through high school. Only 1 dropout in 100 kids, which is a little record I'm very proud of. It's not so much the language I find tough, it's trying to find some time to write books. When you've got 100 children at school, all who have their own, you know, adventures and journeys, it can be tough. In the early days, we didn't have a staff. And in fact, it's the reason that everything I'm wearing was bought for me. I cannot shop any longer, and it's because of some events that happened in my middle 20s. In 2003, Archbishop Desmond Tutu became our patron. We went from sending 4 kids to school, which is pretty manageable, to having 30 kids in our 2003 class. And we didn't have any staff. It was just my best friend at school who did the accounts, and me raised the money and selected the kids. And I'd interviewed 400 kids, got it down to 30 kids that I really believed could go to great schools. We only had the money for about 20, so we sort of stretched the budget. Anyway, they all went. There were a number of volunteers who'd all promised to help out. And I was very surprised that not a single one of them did a single thing. That kind of shocked me. I hadn't anticipated it. So as a result, I used to take 15 kids at a time to a hideous Baroque shopping center outside Cape Town called Canal Walk, and I'd buy them everything they needed for school in a single day. Tennis rackets, uniforms, pens, rulers. That experience, I got into a cold sweat when I even walked past a shopping center or any kind of clothing outlet.
But can I ask you about some of the costumes in the novel?
Oh, I think about clothes for my characters. That's
Yeah.
quite fun.
Okay, I mean, because you just read a story about the peacock blue satin and the silk and the jewels. And
Actually, that
you're
dress
good
I
at
completely
that.
made up.
Oh, yeah.
But what I love to do, I think novels should be truth-filled. And there's a very particular kind of truth that's possible in a story. A novelist makes a pact with his or her reader, and we say, I'm going to tell you a story, believe me. We both know that it didn't necessarily happen, but stories can convey a very profound truth, and I love filling my stories with truthful things, with historical events that actually did take place and that are very accurate in terms of the historical record, but also with objects. I love wandering around museums and antique stores and furnishing places in my own head.
Like the sculptures in the book?
Well, and then other very weird things happened when I wrote this book. I planned the family and the sort of emotional arc of the story, and then I started to really look in detail at what was happening during the Gilded Age, in this period of lush calm before the First World War, that I think has a lot to do with the moment we're living through now. As middle-class Westerners in 2012, we have access to a standard of living that is basically unprecedented in human history. And yet, storm clouds are gathering on the horizon in all sorts of, I think, quite worrying ways. And it made me think of the Belle Epoque. And then really weird things happened. I knew, for example, that there would be a conversation amongst two characters in front of a work of art, and that the work of art would have a story that mimicked what is really happening in the house, and that one character would think he'd been caught. And then I was trying to think, maybe I should make it up, it should be a frieze of a Greek myth, what should it be? And I discovered, I based the house in Amsterdam on a real house. The staircase and the statues that have been on that staircase since 1720 tell exactly the story I'd already made up. And other weird things happened. I knew that there'd be some kind of financial crisis towards the autumn of Piet Barol's first year living in this wonderful house in Amsterdam, working for the Vermeulen-Sickerts family. And when I then turned to the history books, I discovered that there was, in fact, a banking panic in October 1907. I knew that he had heavily overinvested in a hotel, and I discovered the plaza had opened on the 7th of October 1907. And then something weird, Jacobina and Martin, on this trip to New York that I read you from, things are very tense between them because she's done something that she regrets and that she's not going to tell him about. And so because she'll never confess to it, she ensures by the deft bestowal of an empty suite that the first name in the visitor's register is Vanderbilt. And years later, I was at a party at the Plaza for a film, and they've blown up the first page of the first visitor's register, and the name is Vanderbilt. So, sometimes kind of crazy magic happens when you tell stories.
Amazing. And other questions? How's our time, guys? 5 past.
Time for one more? Yes. I do, yeah. I've been here for about a year and a half, and I've written precisely 7 pages of my new book. So I'm trying to find a little more time to concentrate in this wonderful city of yours. But thank you for having me. Yeah, for the foreseeable future.
Well,
Thank you.
shall we applaud our wonderful author? And you're going to sign books.
Thank you.
You'll be signing books as well. for those of you who want a signature.
Thank you for being here tonight.